Go through the papers in a bit more detail. Jack Rowlett is political commentator who joins me now. Jack, good morning.
Good morning.
Shall we look at the front page of The Guardian? Their main story is Mould and squalid housing is making the NHS crisis worse. Whose words are they and what's the sort of argument they're making?
So these are the words of the NHS, and I mean, these are truly appalling statistics. So we're seeing that as many as 31,000 young children, so babies and toddlers, are being admitted every year with conditions related to damp and mold in our housing. I think a major part of the problem here is that tenants are left with so little power in the face of their landlords. You know, I've experienced this before where damp and mold are often blamed on tenants rather than structural issues that can be changed. I mean, it's often written into contracts that damp and condensation are the responsibility of tenants. And I think the lack of accountability here, I mean, it's resulted in some truly appalling tragic cases as we've seen over the past couple of years. So I think the best thing really that we can do is to build accountability structures, of course, but also we do need to just build a lot more housing because that way we can give tenants more power and improve the quality of our housing stock so that this happens less. I do also think it's interesting from the perspective of looking at the factors that are worsening pressures on the NHS and that it's not all just about healthcare policy and government funding, that there are also these other factors that are making us in poorer health, really, and that's putting pressure on the NHS as well.
The article notes that damp is 5 times more common in private rentals than in owner-occupied homes. I guess as well, with squeezed budgets, it is very difficult to do things like prevent it, and you don't want to be freezing cold, ventilating the house if you can't put the heating on.
Yeah, and I think this has been such a big problem over the past sort of 18 months or so with energy costs soaring so high. It's been really hard for families who are struggling to pay their heating bills to keep their houses warm and dry. But actually, better housing stock is just much less vulnerable to these sorts of problems. And actually, so often it is problems with the quality of housing in the first place that's causing that mold and damp issues rather than behaviour of the tenants. And there's nothing that they can really do. But landlords are so quick to blame tenants. Local authorities are often so quick to blame tenants. And that sort of creates a cycle and leads to the problem not being solved. And ultimately, it's vulnerable people, it's children who bear the brunt of that.
There's much more on the front page of The Guardian. Inside The Times, one of The Times reporters was out with the protesters over the weekend, and it's Charlie Parker who's written sort of just a kind of first-hand essay really of what happened. He says that he started the article by saying, "Is this a hate march?" A man wearing a black robe was asked at a pre-protest rally in East London moments before the clock struck 11 on Armistice Day. "Yes, absolutely," he replied with a smile. "We all hate Suella Braverman." What did you make of his analysis of how the day unfolded?
Well, I think I would be hesitant to label it a hate march. You know, there were a huge number of people there, but I certainly think there were large numbers of hateful people there. I saw it myself in London the other day. I think there's a huge amount of anti-Semitism on display, a huge amount of genocidal slogans being chanted, and really the types of protest that and behavior that we would not tolerate if it was being leveled at any other group except Jewish people. And I think although I'm really grateful and I think we should all be pleased that there wasn't as much chaos on Saturday as I think many people were expecting, that actually it's deeply worrying that now every weekend we're seeing huge numbers of anti-Semites out chanting anti-Jewish slogans, holding anti-Jewish placards, making Jewish people feel really uncomfortable in their own country. I think that's totally unacceptable, and I think something does need to change. And I think the police need to take much more urgent action in dealing with these anti-Semitic protesters.
What about the Home Secretary potentially being responsible for inciting more violence? You know, of the 145 arrests on Saturday, the majority of those were far right-wing groups who arrived with the intent to cause trouble and violence.
For sure, for sure. I mean, I think those people would likely have come anyway. I'm not sure that Suella Braverman's comments helped at all. I think it was a deeply unhelpful intervention, and it was unhelpful to try and interfere with the institutional sort of independence of the police in that way. I think part of the problem, though, is that actually action isn't being taken on anti-Semitic protesters until much later on. We are seeing sort of tweets being put up saying, get in touch with Crime Stoppers if you've seen these people. But actually, in the moment, people are not facing the consequences of their actions for those anti-Semitic banners and chants. Whereas I think it's often much more obvious to the police when those counter protesters are behaving in an unacceptable or illegal way, because the manner of their protest is quite different. But I think actually we need to acknowledge that the anti-Semitism on display at these pro-Palestinian rallies is just as unacceptable, and it's just as important we deal with that.
Well, we'll hear about the Prime Minister's plans to kind of change how protests are policed a little bit later today. Let's talk about education. Inside the Times, they've got the comments of these two education consultants who want to say schools should celebrate working class cultural heroes, sort of change the narrative a little bit. And they've come up with some ideas for a curriculum studying, let's say, Billy Elliot, Train Spotting, Great Expectations. What do you make of this?
So I think it's an interesting take for sure. So this is in the book, The Working Classroom. And their essential argument is that so much of what schools do is classist. And I think I really agree with their assertion that we need to be focusing on instilling confidence in working class students. And there's sort of a bit about speaking skills, about a focus on group discussions, which is sort of the approach that private schools often take. But I think their criticism of the assessment structure in schools is unfounded. We know over the last decade we've sort of moved towards focusing on exams more, and that actually that's the best approach we really have, because we know that type of assessment impacts people from poorer backgrounds, people with less stable home lives, less than sort of measures of assessment like coursework. I think the best way we can improve outcomes for poor students, for working class students, is to focus on developing those skills that they mention, also on shrinking class sizes and harnessing new technologies as well, where we can, for example, artificial intelligence.
Yeah, it's interesting, the kind of ideas that they want to be celebrated. There's a fantastic list that you can see inside the paper as well. A page forward than that, the National Portrait Gallery come under a bit of criticism from funding with links to big energy. Well, the boss has said, look, museums, we can't afford to be activists. This is the director of the National Portrait Gallery, because they've had a replacement sponsor for BP. It's a legal firm with extensive links to big energy. Do you think that's fair enough?
Yeah, I do. I think he's essentially presenting a choice, which is to say, well, we're not going to be able to afford to offer these services to people, or they're not going to be as accessible if we don't take this money. And I think it's really important that museums, cultural institutions are accessible to people. And I don't think demanding that BP or whoever this new sponsor is stops funding museums helps anyone. It will just mean in the end that those people from poorer backgrounds won't be able to afford to access museums anymore, and that lots of museums that offer free entry won't be able to do so anymore. It makes culture less accessible, and I think that's ultimately the trade-off here. I think climate policy should focus on climate policy rather than sort of other institutions and blocking access to culture.
So BP has spent millions, so says the paper, into supporting cultural institutions like the Royal Shakespeare Company, the Tate, the National Theatre. All of them have dropped them because there was intense pressure from artists and activists saying, look, BP's fueling the climate crisis, using cultural organisations to greenwash its reputation. That's the counter-argument.
Yeah, I don't think any reasonable person really associates BP with sort of green policies or being at the forefront of the climate revolution because they sponsored some museums. I think it's a deeply sad state of affairs that we've allowed illegal protests like those carried out by Just Stop Oil to affect potentially access to museums in this way. That will be the ultimate consequence of their actions. BP not sponsoring a museum anymore does nothing to solve the climate crisis. It does make culture less accessible potentially. That's bad. It's a net negative, and it doesn't really help anyone.
Let's move on to another story. I don't know who does the chores in your house or who you live with, Jack, but the digital bank Starling, I think this is going to cause arguments, has launched an online calculator, which means you can work out who does the most chores in your household or in your relationship. Would you be plugging in your output or your inputs?
Gosh, no, not at all. I think, an alternative articulation of this is that the digital bank Starling has created a calculator to cause arguments up and down the country. Really, I think, quite frankly, you shouldn't really need a calculator to sort chores in a couple. If you're not able to have these frank conversations about who does the most, then I think you've got deeper problems, really. I think buried in there, though, is a statistic in this article that 72% of women say that they do the most compared to 44% of men. I think that's a real part of the story is this gender imbalance in terms of who does the most. And I think the approach of the bank here is that it's a bit of PR. They're trying to start a conversation, really, but certainly I don't think this would help.
Maybe those women want to start a conversation to say sort of, oh, maybe you could do a bit more loading of the dishwasher. Who knows? One thing, who'll be buying advent calendars in your household? The advent calendars have changed dramatically over the last few years to become extremely expensive. I'm looking inside the Telegraph here. There's a Disney Swarovski advent calendar that costs £1,000. There's a Vogue one that's £350. The criticism here from the former chaplain to Queen Elizabeth has said luxury advent calendars destroy Christmas. Do they?
No, I think he's being extremely hyperbolic here. This is a man who has previously warned that chocolate hot cross buns might be the work of the devil. The most shocking thing about this piece is the fact that, according to YouGov, 34% of UK adults still have an advent calendar. I haven't had one in years.
Really? Oh,
No,
I'm
not
very
at
big
all.
on the advent calendar, definitely. No,
Well, fair enough. But I think one of the few pleasures of being an adult is that you can sort of buy chocolate whenever you want. You don't have to wait to open a little door and have a mouthful every day.
no,
of
it's not
December.
about as a child, I was never allowed a chocolate advent calendar. Absolutely not. You'd get a little picture instead.
Oh, well, that's extremely sad. I feel very sorry for you in that case.
And godparents would often buy the most sort of ludicrously argument-inducing chocolate-filled advent calendars to give to one child, which would then normally be confiscated, it has to be said. Jack, I recommend an advent calendar. I think they're good fun, but maybe not one that costs over £100. That's ridiculous. Do you remember last year, Jack, there was a big argument because Tony's Chocolonely, the company, did an advent calendar, and there was one day where you didn't get a chocolate because they were trying to talk about sort of the fact that maybe when you buy your chocolate, it's not always been made by fair hands, and it caused a big storm and they had to apologise. Do you remember that?
I don't, but that sounds like a horrific trick to play on people on a cold December morning. That's appalling.
Boo. I think there was another day where you got 2 chocolates instead. Jack, thank you so much. Jack Rowlett, political commentator, going through the papers with me. But we've still got at least another couple of weeks before those advent calendars need to get bought and installed.